Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Today is June 7th, 2021, and we are going to start reading the book by Brené Brown. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. I'm not sure that just came up, so I'm going to start it again just in case it didn't. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Lentini, and today is June 7th. We are going to start reading the book I Thought It Was Just Me, but It Isn't by Brené Brown. So on Mondays, I'm going to be reading out loud, and on Fridays, we come together and have a book discussion, and we talk about what we've discovered through the pages, and we just talk about it together. So it's none of us come there as an expert. We just come together to talk about what it brought up for ourselves. So I'm going to read just the introduction today. And then looking at the chapters themselves, they're very long chapters. So I have a feeling that we might be breaking the chapters in half um, or even a third because some of them are very long chapters and I don't want to, as with all of Brené Brown books, I've noticed that there's a lot of information in the books. And so I don't want to take away from any of the information that we're covering just by trying to rush through the chapter. So for today, I'm just going to read the introduction. And if you have the book, you could follow along. If you don't have the book, that's okay. You can just listen to what I'm reading you. And if you want, hopefully you can sit back with some headphones and just listen to the book. So, introduction of Brené Brown's book, I Thought It Was Just Me, but It Isn't. Making the journey from what will people think to I am enough. When people hear the word shame, they often have one of two responses. I'm not sure what you mean by shame, but I know that I don't want to talk about it. Or, oh, shame, I know it well, but I don't want to talk about it. As a shame researcher, I understand our reluctancy to talk about it. Shame is so powerful that we sometimes feel shame is just talking about shame. But after spending 6 years interviewing hundreds of women about their lives, here's what I've learned. We all experience shame. It's an absolutely universal emotion. The less we understand shame and how it affects our lives, thoughts, and behaviors, the more power it exerts on our lives. However, if we could find the courage to talk about shame and the compassion to listen, we could change the way we live, love, parent, work, and build relationships. People often want to believe that shame is reserved for the unfortunate few who have survived terrible traumas, but this is not true. Shame is something we all experience. And while it feels like shame hides in our darkest corners, it actually tends to lurk in all the familiar places, including appearance and body image, motherhood, family, parenting, money and work, mental and physical health, addiction, sex, aging, and religion. This book offers information, insight, and specific strategies for understanding shame and building shame resiliency. We can never become completely resistant to shame. However, we can develop the resiliency we need to recognize shame, move through it constructively, and grow from our experiences. Across the interviews, women with high levels of shame resiliency shared four things in common. I refer to these factors as the four elements of shame resiliency. The four elements of shame resiliency are the heart of this book. And as we learn more about shame resiliency and start to put the elements into practice, we can start to move through the byproducts of shame, which are fear, blame, and disconnection, and move towards the courage, compassion, and connection we need to live our best authentic lives. I've dedicated my career to studying shame and its impact on women, men, and children. In my study with women, I've had the opportunity to interview over 300 participants of all ages, race, ethnicities, and life situations. I've also gone back and re-interviewed 60 women who have applied some of the strategies in this book to learn what strategies have been effective and what barriers they've faced. If you're not sure of the shame's impact on your own life, it may help to read some quotes from my interviews. In these quotes, you can start to see the complex weaving of shame, fear, and cultural expectations. One of the quotes is, "Sex is such a big issue between me and my husband. Sometimes it's great, other times I start thinking about my body and how much it's changed in the past 10 years. I start to feel panicked. I imagine him judging me against the ideals I have in my own head. In these moments, I lose it. I'll pick a fight or do anything to escape and get my clothes back on." Another quote, "One day I was driving down the street in our neighborhood and I stopped next to a car full of young men at a light. They were looking over and smiling. I smiled back and even blushed a bit. Then out of nowhere, my 15-year-old daughter, who was sitting in the back seat with her best friend, snapped, 'Geez, Mom, stop looking at them. What do you think? They're flirting with you? Get real.' I could barely hold the tears back. How could I have been so stupid?" Another quote is, "When I look at myself in the mirror, sometimes I'm okay, but other times I just see fat and ugly. I get totally overwhelmed, like I can barely breathe. I get sick to my stomach and disgusted. I just want to hide in the house so no one sees me." Another quote is, "I'm 41 and I just went back to school to get my degree. Half the time, I don't know what they're talking about. I just sit there and nod my head like an idiot. I feel like a phony, like I'm not smart enough to be there. When these feelings come over me, I just want to slip away, really just grab my purse, slip out of the back, and never go back." Another quote is, "My life looks pretty good on the outside. Nice husband, nice house, cute kids, the whole package. On the inside, it's another story. If we didn't care so much about what other people think, we'd get a divorce. We barely talk to each other. Both our kids struggle in school. We have to make these outrageous contributions to the school just to make sure they don't get kicked out. It's getting harder and harder to keep it all together. Every now and then I know my friends see glimpses of the truth. They have to. It literally makes me sick when I feel like they can see through it all." Another quote, "I constantly feel judged as a mother, like nothing I do is right or good enough. The worst is when other mothers put you down. One disapproving look from another mother can cut me to the core." Another quote is, "I don't tell anyone about the things I've gone through. I don't want them to feel sorry for me or to think differently about me. It's easier to keep my past to myself. Just thinking about being blamed or judged for my past causes me to lose my breath." And the final quote is, "No one knows how bad things are with my husband. They think less of him and less of me for staying with him. I'm constantly lying and making up stories to cover up. When I lie, I feel sneaky and ashamed." Sound familiar? We can make up any of the stories. We can put any of our stories in there. For most of us, the answer is yes. Shame is universal. To varying degrees, we all know the struggles to feel comfortable with who we are in a society that puts so much importance on being perfect and fitting in. Good morning, Stephanie. We also know the painful wave of emotion that washes over us when we feel judged or ridiculed about the way we look, our work, our parenting, how we spend our money, our families, or even the life experiences over which we have no control. It's not always someone else putting us down or judging us. The most painful shaming experiences are often the self-inflicted ones. The constant struggle to feel accepted and worthy is unrelenting. We put so much of our time and energy into making sure that we meet everyone's expectation and into caring about what other people think that we're often left feeling angry, resentful, and fearful. Sometimes we turn these emotions inward and convince ourselves that we are bad and that maybe we deserve the rejection that we so desperately fear. Other times we lash out, we scream at our partner and children for no apparent reason, or we make a cutting comment to a friend or colleague. Either way, in the end, we're left feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, and alone. We spend an extraordinary amount of time and energy tackling the surface issues which rarely result in meaningful, lasting change. When we dig past the surface, we find the shame is often what drives us to hate our bodies, fear rejection, stop taking risks, or hide the experiences and parts of our lives that we fear others might judge. This same dynamic applies to feeling attacked as a mother or feeling too stupid or uneducated to voice our opinions. Until we start addressing the role shame plays, we may temporarily fix some of the surface problems, but we can't silence the old tape in our head that suddenly blares some version of something is wrong with me. For example, that imposter or phony feeling at work or school rarely has anything to do with our abilities, but has more to do with the fearful voice. Who do you think you are? Shame focus forces us to put some value on what other people think, that we lose ourselves in the process of trying to meet everyone else's expectations. How many of us have tapes in our head over and over again? Shame, the silent epidemic. When you spend years studying a topic like shame, it's easy to forget how much people dislike and fear the topic. My husband constantly reminds me not to take it personally when people make the "I just smelled something bad" face after I tell them I'm a shame researcher. A couple of years ago, I had a personal experience that taught me a lot about shame and why courage and compassion are so critical to shame resiliency. I was flying to Cleveland to give a lecture at Case Western Reserve University. As I settled into my window seat, a very energetic woman plunked down in the seat next to me, the aisle seat on my row. I've seen her in the airport chatting up a storm with other waiting passengers and airline employees. After holding up an aisle traffic for the better part of 5 minutes, she got her bag stuffed under the seat in front of her, turned towards me, and introduced herself. We talked for a minute about the Houston weather before she asked, "What do you do and why are you going to Cleveland?" As the plane took off, I raised my voice a bit and said, "I'm a researcher and I'm going to give a lecture at Case." "How wonderful," she responded. "What do you study?" Still fighting against the roar of the engines, I leaned towards her and said, "Women in shame." Her eyes widened and she let out an enthusiastic, "Oh, wow." She leaned so far towards me that her entire upper body was pierced over the empty seat between us. "Women in chains? That's so interesting. Tell me more about it." By this time, the airplane was quiet again. I smiled and said, "Not women in chains, women in shame." "Shame?" she asked in a shocked and disappointed voice. "Yes," I replied. I study shame in the various ways it affects women's lives. With that, the conversation was over. She averted her eyes, then told me that she needed to get some rest. For 3 hours, we sat silent in our seats. Every now and then, I could feel her looking at me and pursing my laptop screen out of the corner, looking at my laptop screen out of the corner of her eye. The first couple of times I turned towards her to smile and acknowledge her, but immediately she would pretend to be sleeping. One time she even threw in a little snore, which I knew was fake because she was wiggling her feet the entire time. When I returned to Houston, I had dinner with a colleague who is a violence researcher. I was anxious to tell her my Women in Chains story to someone who could relate to the pitfalls of researching a less than popular topic. After we laughed about women in chains being preferred to women in shame, she confessed that most people are quite interested in her research, and she normally is the one who fakes being asleep on the plane. "I don't understand," I said. "These are both serious epidemics. Do people actually think shame is worse than violence?" She thought for a minute, then she said, "Well, no, they're both serious epidemics, but shame is a silent epidemic. People understand violence and can talk about it. We're still afraid of shame. Even the word is uncomfortable. You've studied a topic that people have been taught and socialized not to discuss. It's as dangerous as violence, but we just keep pretending that it's not happening." And I think it's more than that. I think it's People can identify as violence as being something outside themselves, whereas shame is something inside ourselves. And we tend to have such an issue with talking about things inside ourselves. I believe my colleague was right. Shame is a silent epidemic. It's a problem of epidemic proportions because it has an impact on all of us. What makes it silent is our inability or unwillingness to talk openly about shame and explore the ways in which it affects our individual lives, our families, our communities, and society. Our silence has actually forced shame underground, which is now permeates our personal and public lives in destructive ways. Shame was once largely misunderstood and discounted by social scientists, but now a growing number of researchers and practitioners are examining shame and its role in a wide range of mental and public health issues, including depression, anxiety disorders, addiction, eating disorders, bullying, suicide, sexual assault, and all types of violence, including family violence. Like the growing epidemic of violence, for many, shame has strangely become both a form of self protection and a popular source of entertainment. Name calling and character assassinations have replaced national discussions about religion, politics, and culture. We use shame as a tool to parent, teach, and discipline our children. Television shows promise cutthroat alliances, backstabbing, hostile confrontations, exclusions, and public humiliation constantly grab the top ratings. And at the same time, we use shame to defend entertainment ourselves. We struggle to understand why the world feels so scary, why politics have turned into a blood sport, why children are suffering high levels of stress and anxiety, why popular culture appears to be sinking to all time lows, and why a growing number of us feel alone and disconnected. As is the case with many epidemics, it seems that we are so mirrored in our own struggles to take care of ourselves and our families, we just don't see the connection that allows us to make sense of it and to begin to address it as a large scale problem. We can't see the enormity of it. We think it's a personal problem or a self esteem issue rather than a serious social problem. To better understand the shame experience, I want you to meet Susan, Kaylee, Teresa, and Sandra. I had the opportunity to, hold on one second, pages are sticking together because it's hot, to interview them in my research and again several years later after they have started putting the shame resiliency strategies into practice. Throughout the book, their unfolding stories will serve as an important example of how powerful and sometimes difficult it can be to practice courage, compassion, and connection. Susan was in her late 20s when we met. She had been married for 3 years and had a daughter who had just celebrated her first birthday. Susan had loved her career as a physical therapist but had spent the previous year at home with her baby. As family finances grew tighter, she had decided to return to work part-time. In our interview, she recalled the day when she thought the right job had landed in her lap. She remembered being absolutely ecstatic. Not only had she been offered a perfect part-time physical therapy position, but her church had an open spot for her daughter in their Mother's Day Out program. Anxious to share her good news, she called her older sister. Rather than congratulating Susan, her sister responded to the news by saying, "I'm not sure why you even had a child if you're not interested in raising her." Susan remembers feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. She said, "I could barely breathe. It was devastating. My first thought was, I'm a bad mother." By that evening, I was reconsidering the job offer. When I interviewed Kaylee, she was in her mid-40s and had built a successful career in advertising. She lived alone in a large city on the East Coast. Kaylee's father had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she was struggling to balance the pressures of her career with her new role as her father's primary caregiver. She explained that the most difficult issue was dealing with her boss, Nancy. Kaylee described Nancy as the kind of person you never share personal information with. When I asked her to explain what she meant, she said that Nancy had perfected the art of the personal attack. The more Nancy knew about your life, the more ammunition she had for her arsenal. When Kaylee's mother died 2 years priorly, Kaylee struggled with depression. She had confided in Nancy about the depression only to have Nancy bring it up in front of other colleagues. Kaylee said that despite her fear of Nancy's attack, she knew she might miss some work while she looked for a long-term care facility, so she explained her father's situation to Nancy. Kaylee still looked shocked as she described the very first staff meeting she attended after she told her boss. During the meeting, Nancy announced that Kaylee was going to be pulled off her current project. Kaylee said, she looked right at me and said to the group, "You know, Kaylee, there's always some kind of drama." Kaylee described that moment as pure paralysis. I froze. I felt so small and sliced open. Was Nancy right? Am I a flake? How could I have been so stupid to trust Nancy? When I met Teresa, she was 35 and had 3 children ranging from age 3 to 7. She describes an experience that probably lasted no more than 5 minutes, but for her represented one of her greatest struggles. She remembered standing in front of her mirror and feeling extremely anxious and hatred about her body. She said, It was one of those days when nothing fit. I had tried on every pair of jeans that I could find. She said she found herself grabbing at the inside of her thighs and pinching the fat that hung over the sides of her bra and chanting, "This is disgusting. I'm disgusted." She said the entire episode was more stressful because she could hear her kids fighting over the television in the other room while the phone rang off the hook. She started screaming at her kids, "Will somebody get the damn phone? I know I'm not the only one who hears it, damn it." She finally buried her head in her hands and started sobbing. When she raised her head up, she saw her toddler standing a few feet away from her. He told her in a frightened voice, "I'm sorry, Mommy's sad." As she stared at him, she was flooded with feelings of shame and self-blame. Teresa told me she would never forget that day and explained, "Sometimes I just get sick of it all. My body, my kids, my house, my entire life. I have these pictures in my head of what I want. These pictures in my head of what I want everything to look like, and it's never that perfect. I just can't ever pull it all together. On top of it, I feel so ashamed when I take it out on my kids." Sandra, a high school teacher in her mid-50s, seemed both angry and sad when she told me, "I used to love to debate politics with my brother-in-law. We did it for years. One night when my husband and I were driving home from Sunday dinner, he told me that he hated when I argued with his brother. He told me he had always hated it. He said, 'Donald is a smart guy. He's got a master's degree. I wish you wouldn't get into it with him.' Then he told me that I sounded uneducated and stupid, and it made him look bad. I became totally withdrawn around his family." Are Susan, Kaylee, Teresa, and Sandra simply struggling from low self-esteem? No. Shame and self-esteem are very different issues. We feel shame. We think self-esteem. Our self-esteem is based on how we see ourselves, our strengths and limitation over time. It is how and what we think of ourselves. Shame is an emotion. It is how we feel when we have certain expectations or experiences, When we are in shame, we don't see the big picture. We don't accurately think about our strengths and limitations. We just feel alone, exposed, and deeply flawed. My friend and colleague, Miriam Mankin, described the difference between shame and self-esteem this way. When I think about self-esteem, I think about who I am in relation to who I want to be, where I've come from, what I've overcome, and what I've accomplished. When I feel shame, I'm taken back to this place of smallness, where I lose that sense of context. I'm returned to a small place, I can't see everything else. It's just a small, lonely place. If these stories aren't about self esteem, could they simply be about the company we keep? Does Susan just have a mean sister? Is Kaylee simply the victim of an insensitive remark? Is Teresa's struggle with perfection an isolated case? Is Sandra's husband the only problem? The answer to all these questions is no. If you look at all four examples concerning motherhood, work, perfectionism, and speaking out, you see that shame is the primary weapon used in these cultural wars. We are constantly threatened, mothers with the shames of our not doing what's the best for their children, or making selfish or ignorant choices. We are constantly threatening mothers with the shame of not doing what's best for their children or making selfish or ignorant choices. Similarly, Kaylee's experience points to the shame culture that has taken over many workplaces. We are expected to produce and keep our professional and personal lives artificially compartmentalized in order to succeed. Her boss's comment is a product of that culture. Although we were told and want to believe you are not your job, the messages from the employers, colleagues, and the media counter that well intended you are exactly what you do, that well intended adage that you are exactly what you do, how well you do it, and what you earn. The world does say that, doesn't it? When it comes to Teresa's struggle, we need to understand that shame is the voice of perfectionism. Whether we're talking about appearances, work, motherhood, health, or family, it's not the quest for perfection that is so painful. It's failing to meet the unattainable expectation that leads to the painful wash of shame. Last, Sandra's story speaks to the power of shame as a social tool that's often used to keep us quiet. Nothing silences us more effectively than shame. As you could see, shame is much more than insensitive communication or a self-esteem issue. It is a basic human experience that is becoming an increasingly diverse and destructive part of our culture. During certain times and in certain situations, we all struggle with feelings of not being good enough, not having enough, not belonging enough. I have found that the most effective way to overcome these feelings of inadequacy is to share our experiences. Of course, in this culture, telling our stories takes courage. Let's see how much longer we have. Oh, just a couple more pages. Courage, compassion, and connection. Courage is a hurt word. The root of the word courage is cur, the Latin word for heart. It's one of the earliest forms the word courage meant to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. Over time, this definition has changed, and today we typically associate courage with heroic and brave deeds. But in my opinion, this definition fails to recognize the inner strength and level of commitment required for us to actually speak honestly and openly about who we are and about our experiences, good and bad. Speaking from our heart is what I think of as ordinary courage. I'm not sure where the term originally courage first appeared, where the term ordinary courage first appeared, but I discovered it in an article on women and girls by researcher Annie Rogers. I think the idea of ordinary courage speaks to the importance of telling our story. It is especially difficult to practice ordinary courage in today's culture of shame, a culture full of fear, blame, and disconnection. However, practicing the strategies in this book will help all of us reclaim our courage and power and even start to change the culture. To understand how shame is influenced by culture, we need to think back to when we were children or young adults and we first learned how important it is to be liked, to fit in, or to please others. The lessons were often taught by shame, sometimes overtly, other times covertly. Regardless of how they happened, we can all recall experiences of feeling rejected, dismissed, and ridiculed. Eventually, we learn to fear these feelings. We learn how to change our behaviors, thinking, and feelings to avoid feeling shame. In the process, we change who we were, and in most instances, who we are now. Our culture teaches us about shame. It dictates what's acceptable and what is not. We weren't born craving perfect bodies. We weren't born afraid to tell our stories. We weren't born with a fear of getting too old to feel valuable. We weren't born with a Pottery Barn catalog in one hand and heartbreaking debt in the other. Shame comes from the outside of us, from the messages and expectation of our culture. What comes from the inside of us is a very human need to belong and to relate. We are wired for connection. I've heard that many times. We are wired for connection. It's in our biology. As infants, our need for connection is about survival. As we grow older, connection means thriving emotionally, physically, spiritually, and intellectually. Connection is critical because we all have the same basic need to feel accepted and to believe that we belong and are valued for who we are. Shame unravels our connection to others. In fact, I often refer to shame as the fear of disconnection, the fear of being perceived as flawed and unworthy of acceptance or belonging. Shame keeps us from telling our own stories and prevents us from listening to others tell their story. We silence our voices and keep our secrets out of the fear of disconnection. When we hear others talk about their shame, we often blame them as a way to protect ourselves from feeling uncomfortable. Hearing someone talk about shame experience can sometimes be as painful as actually experiencing it for ourselves. Like courage, empathy, and compassion are critical components of shame resiliency. Practicing compassion allows us to hear shame. Empathy, the most powerful tool of compassion, is an emotional skill that allows us to respond to others in a meaningfully caring way. Empathy is the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to understand what someone is experiencing, and to reflect back that understanding. When we share a difficult experience with someone and that person responds in an open, deeply connected way, that's empathy. Ooh, I like that. When we share a difficult experience with someone and that person responds in an open, deeply connected way, that's empathy. Developing empathy can enrich the relationships we have with our partners, colleagues, family members, and friends. In chapter 2, I'll discuss the concept of empathy in great detail. You'll learn how it works, how we can learn to be empathetic, and why the opposite of experience shame is experiencing empathy. The prerequisite for empathy is compassion. We can only respond empathetically if we are willing to hear someone's pain. We sometimes think of compassion as a saint-like virtue. It's not. In fact, compassion is possible for anyone who can accept the struggles that make us human, our fears, imperfections, losses, and shame. We can only respond compassionately to someone telling her story if we have embraced our own story, shame and all. Compassion is not a virtue, it is a commitment. It's not something we have or don't have, it's something we choose to practice. Can we be with someone who is in shame and open ourselves up enough to listen to her story and share her pain? An overview of the book. This book is divided into 11 chapters, including this introduction. In chapter 1, I'll share stories and example in order to build a definition of shame and differentiate shame for other emotions like guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. In chapter 2, we'll explore the basics of resiliency, empathy, courage, compassion, and connection. Chapter 3 through 6 will focus on the 4 elements of shame resiliency. In my research, I found that women with high levels of shame resiliency have 4 things in common. When practiced together, these 4 elements move us towards resiliency. In each of these 4 chapters, I'll share specific strategies that we can use to help us develop shame resiliency and information on how we can overcome some of the common barriers women face as they begin to put these strategies into practice. The culture of shame is driven by fear, blame, and disconnection, and it is often a powerful incubator for issues like perfectionism, stereotyping, gossiping, and addiction. In chapters 7 through 9, I'll explore these issues and others in the context of developing and maintaining our shame resiliency. The final chapter will present ideas for actually changing the culture. What does shame resiliency mean for our children, the men in our lives, our spiritual lives, our workplaces, and our families? Shame is a difficult topic. However, as painful as some of the stories may be, the raw honesty of their truth confirms that the information and ideas in this book are tremendous sources of hope and promise for women. I believe that we are all capable of developing resiliency to shame. We are all capable of turning the pain caused by shame into courage, compassion, and connection. Equally important, we are all capable of helping others do the same. However, it is vitally important to recognize the complexity of this work. This is not 4 easy steps to shame resiliency or some other simple recipe for overcoming shame. Cookbook answers don't work when it comes to addressing an issue like shame, or for that matter, any other complex human issue. In fact, it can even be shaming when we believe that there are easy remedies for complicated problems. We tend to blame ourselves for not being able to get it. It has been said the real freedom is about setting others free. In the spirit of that powerful definition, my greatest hope is that we will reach out across our differences and through our shame to share our stories and connect with those who need to hear you are not alone. So, like I mentioned before when I first started, every week until we're done, I'm going to read either the whole chapter or part of the chapter, and then on Fridays we get together just to discuss the book. And again, none of us are coming at it from a perspective of being an expert. We're just coming together to share how we feel about the words that were written and how, we have real honest discussions about what shame looks like in our own lives. So I hope that you enjoyed my reading. I'll be back on Monday to read either all or part of chapter 1. And this Friday, we're coming together for our book review at 1:30. So hopefully you can join me. I hope you have an amazing week. It's Monday, it's hot, and stay cool today, or if you enjoy the heat, go out and enjoy the heat. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye.